the preacher who wed all of his wife's daughters and claimed it was a divine sign of purity, left behind one of the darkest and most unsettling chapters in mid-20th century American religious history. The case, which erupted within a secluded Missouri community during the spring of 1956, began like a small-town rumor and ended as a national scandal. It all started when Deputy Sheriff William Harrington received a deeply troubling report from an elementary school teacher named Martha Jenkins in Oakwood County. Jenkins had grown increasingly uneasy about 3 young girls from the Palmer family who attended her class. The girls were withdrawn, eerily quiet, and bore an uncanny resemblance to one another despite being introduced as half-sisters. What seemed like an ordinary welfare check soon led to the uncovering of a nightmare hidden in the Ozark backwoods. Deep within those rolling Missouri hills stood the weathered wooden chapel of the Pure Light Congregation, a tiny religious group founded in 1947 by Reverend Elijah Palmer. Palmer was a magnetic figure, 49 years old, with a commanding presence and intense blue eyes that could both charm and intimidate. He claimed divine visions had instructed him to build a community devoted to spiritual purity. To his followers, Palmer was a prophet chosen to establish what he called a sacred bloodline, declaring that the Lord has chosen me to preserve his untainted lineage. Over time, he began twisting scripture to justify increasingly extreme beliefs, emphasizing Old Testament stories of patriarchs who married within their families as examples of divine obedience. Palmer's congregation, numbering around 40 people, gradually withdrew from the outside world, settling in a compound 15 miles from the nearest town. By the mid-1950s, it was a fully isolated world where Elijah Palmer's word was law. He had married a widow named Rebecca Wilson in 1946, a woman left alone to raise 4 young daughters after her husband's death. But Palmer's obsession with purity soon crossed the boundaries of morality and law. By 1956, he had taken each of Rebecca's daughters as his spiritual wives. Once they turned 16, the age he claimed God had designated as the age of purity. 3 of those daughters had already given birth, and their children showed alarming signs of physical deformities and developmental delays. When confronted by law enforcement, Palmer defended his acts as divine instruction. He cited ancient patriarchal traditions and told investigators that God had given him special permission to continue his sacred bloodline. Even more disturbing was that Rebecca, his legal wife and the mother of the girls, supported him, fully convinced by years of manipulation that these marriages were holy. Dr. Thomas Mitchell, the county physician who later examined the Palmer children, reported multiple cases of genetic abnormalities, cognitive impairments, and skeletal deformities consistent with inbreeding. For the first time, authorities understood that Palmer's so-called divine lineage was producing generations of children suffering under the physical and emotional toll of incestuous unions. To understand how such a horrific situation endured for nearly a decade, one must look at the psychological and environmental prison Palmer constructed. Former congregation members later explained that he manipulated biblical teachings to position himself as the only man capable of interpreting God's will. Brother Elijah could make you believe anything, recalled one ex-member, Thomas Winters, in a 1957 interview. He'd read a verse and twist it until it meant whatever he wanted. Palmer isolated his followers from the world completely. The compound was reachable only by a dirt road often blocked by snow or mud. Contact with outsiders was forbidden. He told followers that the world beyond their forest was corrupt and filled with spiritual poison. He also controlled every dollar in the community. Members surrendered property and money when they joined, and those who dared to question his authority faced both spiritual condemnation and financial ruin. Education within the compound was another instrument of control. The children learned from Palmer's own handwritten lessons, which distorted science and history to support his theology. He taught that pure bloodlines were sacred and that modern medicine was a tool of spiritual corruption. Rebecca Palmer, the preacher's wife, became a tragic figure in her own right. Having been widowed young and raised in an extremely conservative household, she was vulnerable when she met Palmer at a revival meeting in 1945. Court transcripts and psychological reports later revealed that she genuinely believed she was protecting her daughters by keeping them within the family. Psychologist Dr. Eleanor Reed wrote that Rebecca's worldview had been so completely reshaped by Palmer that she could no longer distinguish faith from delusion. Over the years, Palmer's spiritual marriages evolved from symbolic ceremonies to physical relationships. When his eldest stepdaughter gave birth to a visibly disabled child in 1953, Palmer explained it as a spiritual trial, blaming impurities of the outside world rather than genetics. By 1956, 8 children had been born through his relationships with his stepdaughters, and the majority displayed genetic or developmental complications. Dr. James Harrison, a geneticist who later reviewed the case, testified that the conditions observed among the Palmer children, heart defects, deformities, cognitive delays, and compromised immunity, were the direct result of repeated consanguineous unions. Psychologists who evaluated the rescued children described heartbreaking emotional damage. Dr. Elizabeth Monroe noted that the children had no concept of normal family relationships or personal boundaries. They were traumatized, confused, and deeply mistrustful of adults. Many could not even define who their father truly was, only that Father Elijah was both their parent and spiritual master. The first crack in Palmer's control came through the courage of Martha Jenkins, the schoolteacher who refused to stay silent. When local authorities began enforcing school attendance laws, 3 of the Palmer children briefly attended her class. Jenkins immediately sensed something was wrong. The children were frightened, avoided eye contact, and drew disturbing religious images depicting marriage rituals involving children. She reported her concerns to county officials, but in 1950s rural Missouri, child welfare systems were limited and often hesitant to interfere with religious communities. Jenkins, undeterred, began collecting evidence, the children's drawings, their statements, and behavioral observations. The breaking point came when 9-year-old Ruth Palmer collapsed with a fever at school. When hospital physicians examined her, they found alarming genetic markers and neurological symptoms consistent with inbreeding. The child's hesitant answers about her family marriages prompted immediate investigation. On April 12, 1956, Deputy Sheriff Harrington and social worker Eleanor Price traveled to the Palmer compound. What they found defied belief: teenage girls visibly pregnant, all identified as Palmer's spiritual wives. When questioned, Palmer was unshaken, defending himself through scripture and handwritten theological essays. Rebecca, gaunt and aged beyond her years, stood silently by his side. The subsequent raid on May 3, 1956, involved multiple agencies. 17 children were taken into state custody, and Palmer, Rebecca, and other adult followers were arrested. Investigators soon uncovered decades of Palmer's journals documenting his manipulation of both religion and people. One entry read chillingly, "The widow Wilson is perfect. Her daughters can be molded early, their faith untouched by worldly corruption." The trial began that September, drawing nationwide attention. Reporters from across the country descended upon Oakwood County, struggling to write about a case so disturbing that even newspapers avoided printing the full details. Palmer refused legal counsel, defending himself with biblical quotations and delusional sermons about divine selection. He told the jury, "You call this sin, God calls it perfection." After less than 4 hours, the jury returned a unanimous guilty verdict on 14 counts, including child endangerment and abuse. Judge Hamilton Wilson condemned Palmer for corrupting sacred faith to justify the most obscene betrayal of human trust. Palmer received 30 years in the Missouri State Penitentiary. Rebecca, recognized as a victim of coercive control, was sentenced to 7 years. The daughters, legally adults by then, were not prosecuted. The rescued children were placed in the Oakwood County Children's Home, an overcrowded, underfunded institution that provided shelter but little healing. Psychologists documented years of struggle. The children had difficulty forming attachments, understanding family roles, or functioning in normal environments. Dr. Marion Lewis, who assessed them between 1957 and 1960, wrote, "They have been robbed of the very idea of what family means." Many of the children with severe disabilities were eventually institutionalized for life. Only 3 would go on to finish high school. The story's legacy, however, had far-reaching consequences. The Palmer case, as it became known in academic circles, helped drive reforms in child protection policies and influence new training standards for teachers, doctors, and social workers. As social historian Dr. Eleanor Montgomery later wrote, the Palmer case showed that evil can hide behind scripture, and that ignorance, both scientific and spiritual, can destroy generations.